In 1927, one woman's fate decided the future of thousands. She was labeled feeble-minded, locked away, and put on trial for her future. But recent research reveals that almost everything said about Carrie Buck was a lie that was carefully crafted to push a sinister agenda. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. So in my last episode, I talked about how I split the original episode that I was working on into 3 separate episodes. And part of the reason for that was because I started talking about Carrie Buck and I really wanted to dive a bit deeper into her story. Plus, I had previously gotten requests to do an episode on her, so I felt that she deserved her own episode. Next week, we'll finally be delving into the original episode that I was trying to make when I started all of this, where we'll be digging more into the history of the children's home that we talked about last week and how children that were considered feeble-minded were treated in those homes. So stay tuned for that. I've also been told that I should bring back something that I used to say in my older episodes. It's been suggested that maybe it could be my catchphrase. So buckle up, Buttercup, because you're in for a wild ride. Unfortunately, eugenics comes up way too often in our discussions. The idea that people were born with certain desirable or undesirable traits seems quite foreign to us today, thankfully, but in 1920s America, it was taken for granted that that's just the way that things were. Some people were born smart and others were not, and there was nothing you could do to change it. So, with that belief in mind, there were those who thought that the solution was simple. If they could stop those with undesirable traits from having children, they could breed out those undesirable traits. And of course, in the world of eugenics, an undesirable trait could be anything from your skin color all the way to being feeble-minded, which is how they refer to people with a low IQ. In 1924, the Virginia state legislature passed the Virginia Sterilization Act, which provided for the sterilization of people who were deemed feeble-minded or socially inadequate. Of course, those were 2 very broad categories and could essentially include almost anyone that they wanted, including those who were institutionalized for any reason. Additionally, that same year, they passed the Virginia Racial Integrity Act, which defined Black or Indigenous people as those who had 1/16 or more of Black or American Indian blood. This act prohibited interracial marriage by specifying that the clerk or deputy clerk should withhold granting a marriage license until the registrar's office established the racial classification for each applicant. And these 2 new laws set the course for eugenics in Virginia. We don't know a lot about Emma Buck other than the fact that she was poor and had been abandoned by her husband, Frederick Buck. Then at some point, Emma was accused of immorality, which included prostitution and having syphilis. Those accusations led her to being committed to the Virginia State Colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. The municipal authorities decided that Emma was not capable of being a mother, and her young daughter was taken from her. I think she may have only had Carrie at this point, but she did go on later to have 2 more children, a daughter named Doris and a son named Roy, who we'll talk about a bit later. Now at this time, her daughter Carrie was either 3 or 6 years old, depending on the source, and she was fostered out to John and Alice Dobbs. And Carrie attended public school, where she was said to be an average student. However, in the 6th grade, the Dobbs removed Carrie from school so that she could help with housework. They essentially made Carrie their live-in maid, and they also hired her out to other neighbors who needed help around their homes. When she was 17, Carrie became pregnant as the result of an assault, and the Dobbs had her committed to the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. The reasons listed were feeble-mindedness, incorrigible behavior, and promiscuity. Of course, now we know that the Dobbs nephew is the one who is alleged to have assaulted Carrie, and so it's believed that she was committed in order to save that family some further embarrassment. Now, just a quick side note, when I say assault or SA, instead of saying the actual more harsh words for what happened to her, it's because YouTube doesn't like certain words and they'll ding me for using them. So this is 100% a YouTube thing and not a me thing. I just thought I would mention it because every time I do a story about this, people get so angry in the comments thinking that I'm trying to like downplay what happened to the victim or something like that. I personally wish we could all be adults here and use the correct words for things, but sadly, it's YouTube's world and I'm just living in it. So we got to follow the rules. So in 1924, Carrie gives birth to her daughter and is declared mentally incompetent to raise her child. The state has already labeled her morally delinquent simply for having given birth out of wedlock, and they diagnosed her a middle grade moron and confined her to the colony. Now, according to historian Wendy Klein, a woman could be labeled as having immoral tendency for anything from having been essayed like Carrie was, or just for going out late at night. They could also get this label if they were accused of being a prostitute. Wendy says that being morally deficient was seen as evidence that you were mentally deficient. And it went both ways. If someone was thought to be feeble-minded, it was assumed that they were also prone to immorality. Now, to add insult to injury, when Carrie's daughter is taken from her, guess who they give her to? The Dobbs, which kind of just makes me so mad to think about. Like, the victim in all of this gets locked up and then the criminal's family gets to take her baby. I mean, obviously they're not like responsible for the actions of their nephew, but they also clearly weren't holding him accountable. I mean, if they knew what was going on, either way, it's just so frustrating. So the Dobbs adopt Carrie's daughter, and they name her Vivian Alice Elaine Dobbs. Meanwhile, Carrie is now being sent down the same path as her mother. Her child is taken away from her, and she's being held at an institution, even though she clearly does not need to be there. Now, as I briefly touched on, it's unclear if Carrie reported her assault at the time of it happened or if she waited until later, but it does appear that the Dobbs had a clear motive for trying to get rid of her, whether they thought the pregnancy was as a result of a consensual relationship or if they knew she'd been assaulted. Either way, as soon as they found out she was pregnant is when they petitioned to have her institutionalized, claiming that she was feeble-minded. Like, all this time she's been working for them, they had no issues with her intellect, but now there's an issue. So Carrie is being kept in this institution, and she finds out that the authorities want to take things even further and have her sterilized in order to prevent her from being able to become pregnant and pass her feeble-mindedness down to another child. Carrie, of course, doesn't want to be sterilized and takes her fight to court. But as it turns out, a court case is exactly what the authorities wanted. You see, right around the time that Carrie was placed at the colony for epileptics and the feeble-minded, the state of Virginia had just passed a eugenic sterilization law, and the lawyer for the state hospital really wanted there to be a test before sterilizations could occur. So the superintendent of the colony, Dr. John Bell, he realizes that he needs an inmate that he can try to forcefully sterilize so that that person will then challenge the law and take it to court, and then hopefully the courts will side against her and there will be some type of legal precedent that will be set. So he's looking for someone in his institution that could be a good case for this. According to historian Paul Lombardo, between 1915 and the mid-1920s, there was a dozen or more states that had passed laws allowing for mandatory sterilization of people in institutions. While some of them were actively being used, many of these laws were just on the book and no one was really using them to operate on patients. Some of the laws on forced sterilization had even been struck down by state courts. So the future of eugenic sterilization was uncertain, and this was something that eugenics were really hoping to get nailed down. They wanted to get a case that would go all the way to the Supreme Court and have it upheld so they could have a national legal standard that eugenic sterilization was acceptable. And they only needed one case to make this happen. And with that, both the superintendent of the colony in Virginia and the larger eugenics community were on the lookout for such a person. And unfortunately for Carrie Buck, she seemed to be the perfect person for the job. From the colony's board's perspective, Carrie's feeble-mindedness was doubled by the fact that her mother had also been an inmate at the colony for her alleged prostitution. So, by the laws of heredity, the board concluded that Carrie Buck is the probable potential patient of socially inadequate offspring. It was recommended that she be sterilized for both her welfare and the good of society. Harry Laughlin was an American educator and eugenicist. He was extremely interested in Carrie Buck's case, as he had spent much of the previous decade promoting sterilization as a cheap and effective way to rid the nation of what he called the socially inadequate classes. Historian Paul Lombardo says that eugenical sterilization was Harry Laughlin's life work. Harry really believed that sterilization was truly the answer to improving the genetic pool. In 1922, Harry published a book that compiled a very detailed account of eugenical sterilization. It listed every law that had been passed and every case that had been brought to court. It was the go-to resource for people who wanted to pass sterilization laws. So, when the case was brought against Carrie Buck, Harry Laughlin was asked to be an expert witness. And though he had never met Carrie, his testimony was read into the record as a deposition of the Carrie Buck case, which is so ridiculous. Harry argued that the Buck family was mentally defective, members of what he called the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South. As such, Carrie was certainly likely to give birth to defective children, and he assumed that with her infant daughter Vivian, she already had, though he had also never met Vivian. And as the eugenics hoped, Harry Laughlin's testimony proved persuasive. First, the county judge, then the state Supreme Court upheld Virginia's sterilization law. The next and final ruling would come down from the Supreme Court of the United States. And unfortunately for Carrie, she really stood no chance. There was no one fighting for her, as she had been given a lawyer who was sympathetic to the opposition's cause. He was a founding member of the Virginia Colony's Board of Directors and a firm believer in eugenic sterilization, which again is just so incredibly wrong. The photo I'm showing you, if you're watching the video of this episode, is of Carrie and her mother, Emma. They're sitting together while they wait for the court's decision. Now, this photo was taken by author Estabrook, who was the researcher who was considered an expert in problem families and had come to evaluate the two women on behalf of the state. After taking this photo, author traveled to examine Carrie's daughter, Vivian, who was 8 months old at the time. He would go on to testify that he had given the daughter a mental test and decided that she was below average. At 8 months old, like really? Turns out, as you can see in this photo here, Vivian was being held by Mrs. Dobbs, and she passed a coin in front of Vivian's face, and she didn't react how you would expect something moving in front of your face. Maybe she was distracted by the big camera that was taking her picture. Either way, that was essentially the test. They were like, here's a coin. Oh, okay. Didn't react how we wanted her to. She kept staring straight ahead at probably this giant camera. Yeah, something ain't right with this girl. Really? You guys, these people, so ridiculous. So then author goes on to meet Carrie's sister, who he also decided was feeble-minded, though from what I read, it doesn't sound like he actually even performed any tests on her. I mean, honestly, it really sounds like during this time period, you could say that your neighbors were odd or a little different or strange. And I mean, that could totally be your own opinion. And they would be like, oh yeah, okay. Check the box, they're feeble-minded or mentally incapable. Yeah, lock them up. What? Oh my goodness. Sometimes you just wish it would happen to one of them. Let somebody else tell you that maybe that person thinks you're weird. You know what I'm saying? Who isn't a little weird? So obviously doing some kind of actual proven test wasn't really a requirement for him, because author went on to diagnose Carrie's brother as feeble-minded as well, even though he had never met him. Again, just goes to show how reliable and credible this guy was. And of course, as ridiculous as all of this sounds, author's testimony is ultimately what was used to determine that in this case, the feeble-mindedness was a hereditary defect of this family, which sealed Carrie's fate. And in May of 1927, when the case is heard by the Supreme Court, the case is ruled 8-1 in favor of Dr. John Bell, superintendent of the Virginia colony. The court's opinion was rendered by 86-year-old Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was widely regarded as America's most brilliant legal mind. He said, if she is allowed to reproduce, or if the Carrie Bucks of the world in general are allowed to reproduce, this will be deleterious to American society. And so, therefore, the government has the authority to step in and in the pursuit of the greater public good to suppress her individual right to reproduce. Justice Holmes went on to write, it is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifesting unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So sick, man. After permission was given by the courts, the procedure was performed on Carrie by Dr. Bell at the colony on October 19, 1927. The procedure took 1 hour, and the medical notes say that Carrie's recovery was uneventful. 4 months later, Carrie is paroled and said to be in good health. At trial, the colony representatives had testified that after her surgery, they would allow Carrie to move back in with the Dobbs so that she could spend some time with her daughter. But that did not happen, and instead, she was placed with another family who claimed that she had used a dishpan as a chamber pot and sent her back to the colony. After that, Dr. Bell tried to get the Dobbses? It's Dobbs, so you say Dobbs or Dobbses. Dr. Bell tried to get the Dobbs to take Carrie in, but they refused. Mrs. Dobb didn't think that Carrie should have been released in the first place. Kind of sounds to me that Mrs. Dobbs may just not have wanted Carrie around Vivian. Of course, that's purely speculation, but that's immediately where my mind goes. So Carrie is sent to live with another family who is 200 miles away, and this family, the Newberrys, were said to have been pleased with Carrie's work ethic. Over the course of a few years, Carrie writes back and forth with the colony, hoping to be fully released and also attempting to not be readmitted. Mrs. Newberry wrote to Dr. Bell and complained that Carrie is beginning her adultery again. However, despite this, Carrie stayed on with the family for a few more years, even after being formally discharged from the colony in January of 1929. She is marked as improved and fully discharged from the colony's care. And as it turns out, Carrie went on to live a pretty normal life, despite the horrible things that had been done to her. Now, I mentioned earlier that Carrie had been an average student in school. Well, it turns out that her daughter, Vivian, was also not feeble-minded. After being adopted by the Dobbses, Vivian had attended public elementary school and, by all accounts, was considered of average intelligence. She struggled some in math, but was an average student in most other subjects and was even on the honor roll prior to her death at only 8 years old when she died from a stomach infection. There was nothing to indicate that she was feeble-minded. Not that any of this would have been okay even if she had been mentally handicapped, but something about the fact that they seem to have just kind of like made up this whole thing, it just makes it feel even worse somehow, which also includes one of the other things that kept being brought up at Carrie's trial as proof that her mother was immoral and that she had inherited her mother's immorality was that they claimed Carrie had been born out of wedlock and she had gone on to have her own child out of wedlock. But there were very clear records that this was not true. Even if we ignore the fact that Carrie's situation was not consensual, her parents were married for years prior to Carrie having been born. And so there was actual evidence against what they were arguing, but it's clear they didn't care about facts. 3 years after being discharged from the colony, Carrie marries a widower named William D. Eagle, who was nearly 40 years older than her. And she continued to correspond with Dr. Bell at the colony as her mother was still an inmate there. In 1933, she wrote to Dr. Bell saying, "I would just love to take mother out for this winter, and if nothing happens so I can't, and if you will let her come, I will make preparations for her to come and I will meet her. I do not have but 2 rooms, but still she is welcome to come and stay with me. We live out in the country, we have a pig and a nice garden, and are putting up a lot of things this summer. I will see that my mother is well taken care of and plenty to eat if you will let her come. I am real anxious for her to come. Unfortunately, it never happens. Later that same year, Dr. Bell resigned from his position, and Carrie no longer had direct contact at the colony. However, that did not stop her from continuing to write to the colony in hopes of getting her mother out. In 1940, she wrote a letter inquiring about her mother, as she had not heard about her in a while, and she got a response back from the new doctor that said Emma is well and happy most of the time. In 1944, Carrie got news that her mother was ill, and so she traveled to the colony. When she arrived with her brother Roy, the staff informed them that Emma had died 2 weeks before and had already been buried in an unmarked grave in the colony cemetery. While the colony ultimately lost touch with Carrie, the Buck versus Bell case would prove to be an extremely important ruling that paved the way for 8,000 state-mandated sterilizations in Virginia and more than 60,000 across the United States. This ruling was used to forcibly sterilize both men and women, and decades later, it would become a source of national shame. Though most would not remember the woman who was at the center of it all. By the time of her mother's death, Carrie was a widow, and in 1965, she married again an orchard worker named Charlie Deltamore. They moved to Charlottesville, and at some point after that, she was able to reconnect with and see her sister Doris from time to time. Now, Carrie's sister Doris's story is super tragic as well. When she was taken from her mother as a child, instead of being sent to a family, Doris was sent to live out her childhood in a foster home in an institution. Once she grew up and moved out on her own, Doris had married, and she and her husband tried for years and years to have a baby with no luck. They eventually enlisted doctors who simply told them that it was impossible for Doris to get pregnant. In 1979, Doris applied for a Social Security card, but she needed a birth certificate to get it, and she didn't have that. So they contacted the institution where she had grown up, and this correspondence is what led to researchers being able to later discover that she was actually the sister of Carrie Buck. Now, I was a little confused as to whether Carrie and Doris had already gotten in touch with each other before that, or if this led to the two of them being reunited. But either way, in the summer of 1979, the researcher who was looking into Carrie's story and had discovered Doris was her sister found out where Doris was living and went to pay her and her husband a visit. So when he arrives, he starts talking to them about everything he's discovered. He starts talking about Doris's date of birth and the date that she had been sterilized. And Doris immediately starts to cry. He had just told her something that she didn't know. At this point, she and her husband had been married for 40 years, and so many of those years had been spent trying to get pregnant. She had blamed herself that they were unable to have a family. She was completely unaware that she had been sterilized without her consent or even her knowledge. At the age of 12, she had been accused of promiscuity and feeble-mindedness and sent to an institution. When she was 16, they had performed an operation on her, but she had been told that it was an appendectomy. Turns out that after the ruling was made in her sister Carrie's case, the younger sister Doris had been selected in one of the first groups of women to be sterilized under the expanded program. So these researchers were not only able to pinpoint that Doris was Carrie's sister, but around the same time, they were able to dig up a lot of the other information that I've been sharing throughout this episode, things such as Carrie's parents' marriage certificates proving that she wasn't illegitimate. And researcher Paul Lombardo is the one who was able to dig up Carrie and her daughter Vivian's school records to show that they were both average students. And in fact, that Vivian was on track to possibly be above average if she had not sadly passed away so young. He is also the one who discovered the photos of Carrie and Emma and Vivian, some of which I've shared if you're watching this episode. He also discovered the letters that Carrie had written, which show her very neat cursive script, yet another piece of evidence that Carrie was not a feeble-minded threat to society, but a thoughtful, hardworking woman with a fierce devotion to the people she loved. In 2002, Paul sponsored a historical marker memorializing Carrie Buck's story and the Supreme Court decision that changed her life forever. In 1973, a 30-year-old Black woman named Neil Ruth Cox entered a North Carolina law firm with a record of her forced sterilization. This led to a shocking court case that exposed the decades of sterilization abuse, in the name of eugenics. And this is when it came to light that the eugenics boards in 33 states had overseen the sterilization of thousands of people between the years of 1907 and 1977. As I mentioned earlier, the victims were both men and women, though of course it was mostly women. Nearly all of the victims were classified as feeble-minded, and the procedures were either performed against their will or with coerced consent in some cases. In the decades that have passed since all of this came out, only a few states have issued formal apologies. And only 3 of the states involved, North Carolina, California, and Virginia, have offered compensation to the survivors of these sterilizations. The survivors are said to live in a space between relief that there has been some sort of public recognition after the decades-long battles they have fought to raise some sort of public awareness, and the sense that no amount of compensation could ever replace what was taken from them. All right, you gotta say hello. Hey, hello. She never knows what I'm doing. I'm gonna hold her up like this. Okay, you can get comfortable again. Go ahead.